Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Omens. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Just Capital, and we really appreciate you joining us today. We're so excited to welcome a powerhouse group of people to this dialogue about corporate transparency on racial equity and investment decisions. We are going to have a series or a brief presentation by my coworker Kavya Vaghul, and then go to a panel discussion. So let me introduce everyone on the line, and then we'll hand it over to Kavya. Also, just a reminder that you can ask questions throughout in the control panel, and we will be taking questions towards the end of the call. So let me begin by introducing everyone. We have Michael Garland, Assistant Comptroller for Corporate Governance and Responsible Investment in the New York City Office of the Comptroller. Mary Morris, who's co-chair of the Human Capital Management Coalition and Investment Officer for California State Teachers Retirement System, as well as Kavya Vaghul, Senior Manager for Wages and Workers at Just Capital. And moderating, we're delighted to have Rebecca Greenfield, who's reporter and editor for Bloomberg Business. So let me pass it over to Kavya to tell us a little bit about the state of disclosure to ground the conversation of corporate America on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Kavya?
Thanks so much, Allison. So since last year, Just Capital has been collecting a series of data points that assess whether a company has publicly disclosed data on workforce demographics with a specific focus on gender and race and ethnicity. We started collecting this data for all of the companies that we rank in the Russell 1000 index in order to build a benchmark for not just what good disclosure looks like, but also eventually what representation looks like at America's largest employers. I'm excited to share with all of you today a sneak peek of the demographic data that we have been including in this year's rankings. Note that it's just a snapshot of the data as of July 3rd, and it's subject to change. Our preliminary analysis shows that nearly 40% of companies disclose data on the gender identity of their workforce, and 60% have no disclosure. Close to 30% of companies disclose some type of data on the racial and ethnic identity of their workforce. These disclosures on race and ethnicity vary pretty significantly in the level of detail provided, and highly detailed disclosure is the rarest to come by. For instance, of the companies that disclose some race and ethnicity data, most share the percent of workers identifying as non-white minorities. Fewer share detailed data on race and ethnicity, which at the very least includes data on the percent of workers identifying as Asian, Black, Latinx, or white. Even fewer, just 4% of companies publicly disclose either a PDF of their EEO-1 report or the data that would be typically available in an EEO-1 report. So I think the natural next question is, what exactly is an EEO-1 report? In short, it's the most detailed data available on gender, race, and ethnicity that a company can provide. Each year, private employers with 100 or more employees are required to file an Employer Information Report, or the EEO-1 report, to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The report looks at like what you see on the screen. It asks employers essentially to submit the raw numbers of employees by their gender and race and ethnicity for 10 standardized occupational categories. The rich detail in an EEO-1 report can help us answer really important questions about the intersectional representation across different levels of the company. So as of July 23rd, an estimated 37 companies disclose their EEO-1 report or the intersectional data by gender, race, and ethnicity, typically available in one. As we'll see on the next slide, while disclosure is uncommon across the board, we find that companies in the technology sector are most likely to share an EEO-1 report. So 57% of companies who disclose an EEO-1 report were in tech. And this isn't necessarily surprising to us, since a call to action to release the numbers in 2013, which was due originally to concerns about a leaky pipeline of women in engineering, tech companies have been releasing and been transparent about sharing their diversity statistics. Perhaps even more important than disclosure, however, is what the numbers actually say about representation of women and minorities at these companies. As of July 23rd, Our preliminary analysis of the data from the 37 companies that disclose an EEO-1 report showed that on average, 36% of workers at companies who disclose their EEO-1 report identify as women. As you can see, in comparison to the US population, women are pretty underrepresented at these 37 companies. We also find that on average, just 15% of workers at these companies identify as Black or Latinx. Again, compared to the US population, Black and Latinx workers are very underrepresented. So what about when we look at the intersectionality of the data for these 37 companies? On average, we find that just 3% of women at these companies identify as Black and 4% identify as Latinx. Representation of Black and Latino women is even lower at companies in the technology sector, with around 1% and 2% respectively identifying as Black or Latina. There's obviously so much more to discuss and so much more to explore within the EEO-1 data and all other demographic data that we collect. But in the meantime, I would be very remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that while highly detailed data and EEO-1 data is a critical benchmark, it's still not a panacea for the state of diversity at companies. There's so many different aspects of diversity, such as age, sexual orientation, and gender identity, or disability status, that doesn't track in an EEO-1 report, and that we're currently unable to collect because of low disclosure rates. We hope that this changes in the future. And with that, I'll pass it back to Allison.
Thank you, Kavya. Really interesting. You know, a lot of what Just Capital is trying to do, and Kavya, the work that you're leading, is to understand the current state of play on disclosure in America on huge societal issues, including race, including demographic data, gender, wages, and more. So if anyone is ever interested in understanding more about what Just Capital is tracking and the trends that we're seeing, please feel free to reach out to us. And again, excited to welcome Rebecca Greenfield, who's editor and reporter at Bloomberg, heads up diversity coverage there, for our amazing panelist to hear more about how investors are thinking about EEO-1 and diversity disclosure overall. And Rebecca, I understand that Bloomberg, you and others are also leading up your own project. So would love to invite you to speak about that and then kick off the panel moderation. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks, Kavya, for that great presentation. So yeah, I'm a reporter and editor at Bloomberg, been covering diversity issues for a while now, and we at Bloomberg, from a news perspective, are interested in a lot of the same things that Just Capital is, and that the other panelists are, which is, you know, transparency and disclosure. For us, we cover companies, we cover diversity. We want to know what companies look like. It's very, you can only report on really what you know. And for us, it's not only news when we get to say a company discloses because it's so rare, but then from there, we can use it as a tool to figure out why. So I would say we've always been interested in any types of transparency disclosures, but over the last few months with the protests and increased interest in Black Lives Matter, we've definitely kind of tried to put more muscle behind getting some of the information that we're all after, so we're also trying to get EEO-1 forms from the top 100 companies in the S&P 500. It's just asking, seeing if they'll do it based on, you know, their apparent commitment to diversity. And I would say interest is slightly more, you know, people are slightly more open than we've seen in the past, which is really encouraging. We are also interested in learning more about diversity at all parts of companies. I mean, we know a little bit about the top of the C-suite. We're really interested in board diversity, which is also something that companies don't have to disclose, and I think we should know more about. We're also interested in pay gap disclosures, which I know is another topic, but really, I guess to reiterate a point, because so few companies do this, it's really, we're just trying to get a benchmark of figuring out what's out there and saying, you know, companies, put your money where your mouth is. You say that you are committed to diversity, So what does your company look like? And if you start reporting it, you can measure progress and change, or see some trends or what's happening. And that's really what we're hoping to get, and hoping to really capitalize off of this movement that we're seeing now. So that's me and my what I'm interested in. I think everyone on this panel has we're coming from the same place, but I would love to kind of shift the focus to our panelists, who, again, thank you all for coming. So on that point, we've seen this urgency over the last 2 months. We've seen promises from companies. I think every major company put out a statement of some sort supporting Black Lives Matter, or saying we don't support discrimination. But I'm wondering what you're seeing in the field of what companies are actually doing. You know, what's the balance between statements companies are making versus the disclosures that they're actually putting out there? And this is for all of you.
Well, I'm happy to kick off. Thanks, Rebecca. I also want to thank Allison and Kavya and Just Capital for inviting me on. So New York City the city's pension funds have a long history of advocating for diversity from the boardroom all the way down to the shop floor at our portfolio companies. And the systems hold, more than 3,000 companies here in the US, and we've engaged many of them on diversity. And you, Rebecca, you sort of took the words out of my mouth. From the investor perspective, we're trying to operationalize more or less what Bloomberg is doing. So certainly in the wake of the racial justice protests, precipitated by the George Floyd and other murders, we were heartened to see all these leading companies putting out statements in support of racial equality or affirming their own commitment to diversity and inclusion. We also wanted to see if companies were going to put their money where their mouth was. So we evaluated the S&P 100 and identified more than 75 companies that had put out statements, and a significant minority of those also provide comprehensive EEO-1 disclosure today. And so we wrote to all of those, I think it was, somewhere north of 65 companies that affirm their commitment to diversity and inclusion, but that do not currently provide the EEO-1 report disclosure. And so we sent a letter to those companies asking them to provide absent disclosure, investors have no way to assess and benchmark. Companies may say they're committed, and when we talk to companies, they certainly like to tell us all the great stuff they're doing to promote diversity in their companies, but we have no way, to evaluate that. We don't know what's real and what's not. So give us the numbers so that we can actually assess your performance. And the EEO-1 data, first of all, companies are already collecting it, as Kavya mentioned. One other advantage is it has a sliver for senior management, which includes all employees roughly, I think, within 2 reporting levels of the CEO. So if you're really interested in seeing how companies hire, retain, and promote women and people of color, the EEO-1 report is an extremely useful tool.
I want to hear from Mary also on this, but before I move on to hear from her, have you heard back from companies yet? I know it was really recent, but what's the initial reaction been?
So it is a little recent. I put the responses into 2 baskets. We've had some companies acknowledge receipt of the letter and potentially put down a marker for engagement, or tell us things like their board or senior leadership was already discussing how they can better illustrate, and back up their statements. And it sort of suggested that we were putting in our request at the right moment in terms of where the leadership was in their dialogue. We've also had some requests for engagement. We're happy to talk to companies, but we are a little concerned that we're going to fall into this trap where companies are again going to want to tell us all of the things they're doing to promote diversity, or why the disclosure they're currently providing with respect to employee diversity is enough, and then tell us why the EEO-1 report somehow is ill-suited to the very unique organizational structure of their company.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's I'll jump off right off on that point, because I smile because we know that it's not proprietary information. It's not information that companies should not be disclosing. So thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm Mary Morris from the CalSTRS, which is the California State Teachers Retirement System. I'm also the co-chair of the Human Capital Management Coalition, which is about 30 institutional investors now, greater than $4 trillion. I think it might even be higher at this point now. And Michael is a part of that as well. And I'm very happy to be here. So thank you. And thank you, Rebecca, for highlighting this, because it's so important to us, right? For that question, I really want to highlight the metrics that the human capital management is out there asking, not only through regulatory, but also in engagement through our companies. Diversity is an important piece in it, and the 4 metrics we believe that should be disclosed, but is already being tracked. And if a company is not tracking this information, then we're very concerned, because we really do want it to be at the board level, board oversight, and of course at the chief human resources, but not just information that is just, one-off meeting with the board, because diversity across the board, across the board itself, tied to the long-term strategy and the board composition is important, but also the C-suite and also down through the pipeline of the company, right? How are you going to fulfill your long-term strategy? And as investors, we're very interested in that. So the 4 metrics we really want companies to include, and these are just really modest asks, and this is information they should have, right, is workforce composition, full-time, part-time, and contingent workers, the cost of your workforce, because we're interested in what is the return on your investment. As Michael said, that human capital is the most important asset of a company, and we definitely do believe that. And so, how are they treating that? How are they showing the value of those employees? So it'd be salaries, bonus, pensions, transfer, all of that information. Turnover is a simple metric, and it should be voluntary and involuntary information, because it's going to, tie to how well is the company, managing their employees. Are they able to retain employees? We also know the costs that to replace employees. We also believe that diversity, that's the important piece. So, and we're asking for gender, ethnic, racial diversity across seniority, C-suite pipeline. And so I'll leave it there, because I know you have other questions, but it really is, we'll talk later about our issues and how we're looking at diversity overall and in our engagement. But for the Human Capital Management Coalition, 4 simple metrics. Identifying this information can put into context what's happening at COVID-19, what's happening with the racial justice. You can really identify whether the company is utilizing their employees properly, tied to their long-term strategy.
And on those metrics, is it also similarly difficult to get disclosures as it is on diversity metrics, or are you seeing a little bit more disclosure there than anything else?
You mean on the diversity data?
You have those 4 metrics, and so
yeah, we are having problems, and we're asking companies. There are some companies that do provide some of this information, but not necessarily all. I think Intel is a good example of where they provide some information that does put things in context, and they really do quantify the turnover number and information. Some of the companies are putting out diversity reports, but we really want these metrics included in their actual filings, right? Not necessarily on one-off reports, because we really want it to be comparable, consistent, reliable, information across the companies.
And I'll quickly add to that too. With Just Capital's data, we've been kind of tracking whether these other data points around diversity and inclusion, particularly this turnover data point, which gives you a better sense of whether communities of color and people of color are actually able to stay in these workplaces, that inclusive environments are being cultivated for them. historically we've seen pretty poor disclosure around them, even in these one-off diversity and inclusion reports. But now I think there has been some traction that's been picking up that's showing signs that disclosure may increase with all of the new focus that's happening on racial equity issues in this country.
And also, just to underscore Mary's point, I mean, the current state of disclosure is uneven. And one of the core objectives of the Human Capital Management Coalition is mandatory universal disclosure by all US filing companies. We petitioned the SEC, and in response to a proposed rule to amend Reg SK, the SEC has issued a principles-based proposal that would be fairly deferential to companies. They basically acknowledge the importance of human capital, but left it up to companies to decide which metrics are material. And again, there's all kinds of opportunities for management to select the metrics that they think show them in the best light, whether that's diversity. Well, not diversity is not even, they can pick whatever issue they want.
Yeah, so since it is still voluntary, it's Michael, you brought up the exact same things we're hearing from companies too, which is, we disclose this metric, so why I don't use that, or, here's all the great stuff we're doing on diversity, look over here. And so I'm wondering how you all incentivize companies to disclose and get people to actually put out these numbers when sometimes they don't look so great.
Well, first of all, we're an owner, so we have capital invested with them, and it's difficult for us to provide a positive incentive. As we signaled in our letter to companies, I think we gave them an August 30th deadline to give us a commitment. We certainly have the ability to file shareholder proposals seeking the data, which we have done in the past. We also have the opportunity to withhold support from the election of board members from unresponsive companies.
And if I can add to that, I think, Michael, you're right about that, but I think there is empirical evidence and research on diversity as well as human capital management, as Michael said. And I think that that incentive really should be that companies should be wanting to be able to provide this information, because I don't know if you're aware of the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, and Dr. Anthony Hesketh, he came out. And so as Michael spoke about the Reg SK, we did try to provide empirical evidence and research on the reasons why certain metrics should be disclosed. And there was, within the study itself, there was identifying specific metrics, which also include diversity, that identify that if these metrics are disclosed, the companies outperform. It's quantitative, meaning specific metrics, but also qualitative in providing some context. But it is amazing, though, that the companies that provide stronger metrics with less narrative actually outperform the companies who put lots of narrative in, lots of different reports in, but don't necessarily provide metrics. So, and I think the study came out really to say that disclosure is key, right? It's critical to understanding how organizations utilize, retain, and maximize the potential of its employees. Narratives without metrics, metrics without narratives will not move the needle, and both are needed for good disclosure. So the evidence is there, and so companies should have that incentive, right? And for us, the incentive is the companies perform well, then we're able to pay for our beneficiaries for their benefits, and for us, it's for the California State teachers.
So thanks, Mary. Rebecca, let me add one more reason why it would be in a company's self-interest to disclose. I think our objective today is systemic voluntary disclosure, but ultimately we'd like it to be mandatory. But in a world where there is widespread disclosure, it will allow, how does a board benchmark their company to another company if there's not data available on a like-for-like basis? So, boards can see how they are stacking up against their peers or other companies, assuming those other companies are also disclosing. So I think there's a benefit to the marketplace if we had widespread disclosure.
And it
And
seems
Kavya,
like,
oh, I'm sorry, Rebecca. I was going to just say, Kavya, because I know Just Capital has put a lot of information out recently, especially after COVID-19. And as investors, we've been relying on your data. So if you want to add something on the incentive piece.
No, I think absolutely. One of the really critical features of the EEO1 report, for instance, is the fact that it is cross-comparable across companies because you have standardized occupation categories, you have raw numbers that allows you to compute intersectional data in the ways that you need it to be able to compare across different companies. And so having that standardized disclosure is really, really critical. I'll say one more thing. I think that there's the investor argument for it, but then there's also the American public argument for it. We have polling that shows that the American public is immensely in favor of holding companies accountable, or seeing them rather disclose information about the state of demographic disclosure, the state of diversity in their workforces, everything about their living wage, committing to different elements that bolster equity in the workplace. And that push from both the investor side as well as the American public, I think, is really critical in showing American companies that all stakeholders are looking for this information. And I think that's an important point as well.
you're still on mute.
So I was just adding that also, important to potential future employees who may want to join a company that, has a clear commitment to diversity and is able to demonstrate progress.
Yeah, I
just really quickly.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, just really quickly. That another incentive is even when we talk to our external managers and their identification of allocating capital, like Michael was saying, if the company doesn't disclose that information, we're going to find out the information through, Glassdoor. Why not the company tell their own story and share how it all ties into their long-term strategy?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say from my experience that, Michael, you mentioned something about if other companies want to benchmark against their competitors. And in some transparency disclosures, we have seen kind of this cascading effect. Like you mentioned, all the tech companies did it. With pay gap disclosures, when they were asked to do equal pay for equal work disclosures, we saw kind of all the banks did it and they all followed. All the tech companies did it and followed. But then we've hit a wall a little bit when it comes to more specific or disclosures that are harder to look as good. So when we ask companies to disclose, like Intel did, the enhanced EEO1 form. So we reported on that. Jeff Green, a reporter on my team, wrote a story about how Intel was the only company to disclose the pay information with the demographics information, which was collected this year by the government. And we were hoping other companies would follow, and really very few, or I don't know, maybe one other did. Same thing with pay gap figures. Citigroup published the raw pay gap figure, and we were thinking the other banks would follow, and we really didn't see it. So I'm wondering, if you guys are seeing the same thing and how to maybe overcome that issue.
Oh, I think Mike, you're on mute.
Oops, I keep doing that, sorry. I think you're right about certain, a little bit of momentum in particular sectors. From our perspective, this is going back, I think, to around 2012. We initially focused on the advertising industry and the financial services, both of which have a history of underrepresentation of women and minorities, particularly in senior ranks. We had tremendous problems with the ad industry. The companies we were engaging were extremely resistant, but there has been much more, there was, I think, a General Accountability Office report on the financial services data that demonstrated that the industry was lagging. I think that, helped give us some momentum in our engagement. Look, we know your industry isn't very good. Show us how you're doing in an industry that really is lagging. And then I think the tech momentum, just anecdotally, we don't know as an industry, but there's a lot of anecdotal information out there about diversity practices.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think in terms of disclosure, you're right. In our universe, Intel was one of the only companies that disclosed the component 2, which has typically the pay and then the hours breakdown for all of the EEO1 report categories, which is incredible. But I think some of the hesitance around that is kind of employee identification. I think that there's concerns about what do you even do to start beginning to close those gaps, or whether these are representative of the different categories of workers that we have within our particular industry. And I think that, again, I'll harp back on the point that this is really a benchmark, right? The idea is that by putting this information out there, an accountability is being set as well to show that you're improving year over year, or to show that you're making an effort, or that you're putting concerted progress towards something. And I think that if companies think about it in that regard, like, there, of course, may be judgment around what's put out now, but showing that improvement year over year, I think builds goodwill with both the American public, the employees, and all of the different stakeholders in a way that I think is important, and I think can really transform what equity looks like at these workplaces.
And I think it's just what Kavya is mentioning, I think that's really important. I think that the piece is that even chief human resource directors that we speak to, I think they're interested. It just has to get that message up, to the board, through the board, down to the C-suite, and then sharing that information. Think about anything on disclosures, right? We sent a rulemaking proposal on board composition a while back. Michael was part of that as well, and a lot of institutional investors. And everything moves very slowly, unfortunately. And I think companies that start moving will then help enhance and provide that momentum. So I think it is an important piece. It's coming, but pretty slow.
And I think one other thing that I'll add is that the reality is that putting your diversity numbers out there isn't going to solve all of the problems. It is one step, a very preliminary step to being able to understand what the state of diversity at a company really is. And then it's all of the activity that happens around the programs, different types of kind of opportunities for promotion and hiring for women and women of color, and the opportunities that build in different ways, like analyses around equity in different dimensions. I think all of these parts are really critical to ensuring that you're building upon it. And so we're hoping that it's just one benchmark that jogs or I think starts or sparks more interest in putting in effort, energy, and resources into all of the different things that make a truly inclusive workplace.
Yeah, it provides that substance to what they're already trying to say out there, right?
Yeah, I'd say from our perspective, as reporters, it like exactly provides the substance. It's much easier for us to report on or believe a company when they talk about their diversity efforts if we can show, first of all, what problem it's trying to solve and what progress you've made. So I think companies would love if we just wrote about every single, diversity engagement effort they had, but I think it's becoming harder for us to justify doing that unless we know more about the numbers. So that's an incentive from our perspective. On that note, I would love if you guys could talk about why the push for EEO1 disclosure specifically, and why right now that was the most important thing to engage companies on. Michael, since that's what you did, I'd love to hear from you on that.
There you go.
I think my signal may be, let me keep going. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
It is the correlation between, diverse workplaces, diverse companies with diverse workforces tend to outperform. I think McKinsey has done some of the most, broadest research, and particularly in senior management. And the value of the EEO1 report is, A, it's cost effective. Companies already have it. They have to collect it. And it allows for, both benchmarking and year-over-year comparisons, which, a lot of companies like to just put out percent data, which, investors like quantitative numbers numbers so we can actually assess performance. And the EEO1 report, it's not a panacea. It does solve a problem. I mean, it is the gold standard, I think, and it does solve a problem for investors.
I think for us, it's also just an apples to apples comparison. It's very hard to compare diversity reports because we don't know what, if everyone had to do the same diversity report, we'd be interested in that too, but it's become difficult to use those as a way to look across an industry for us personally.
I know, Rebecca, companies, they do say, oh, all these categories don't fit our needs. But companies can actually put that into context, right? If they disclose that information, they can put it in context. There are certain requirements that require them to put them in these categories, but for our sake, for investors' sake and other stakeholders' sake, put it in context. What does each category mean to your company?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that some parts of the form don't. I'm with you, companies. I understand that some parts of the form don't correlate to your company, and we're willing to work with you on that to make it clear when it's clear, for sure. Mary, can you talk about CalSTAR's approach to diversity and what's driving your prioritization as a business imperative these days?
Right. So at CalSTAR, this has been an initiative for quite a period of time, and it goes back at least maybe 10, 15 years ago, right? And it really is about driving value from the investor's perspective. And we do approach diversity through a multifaceted approach. So every year we put a diversity in the management of investments report, and it not only shows internally, so this is our perspective of in the investment office, what our profile looks like for, and we do race, ethnicity, age, gender. We break it down a lot, so just to show how diverse investment staff is. And then within that report, we also talk about our engagement efforts. And the multifaceted approach, what I was speaking about was, I'm the co-chair of the 30% Coalition, and their mission is really to push boards and to engage boards. And we have a coalition of, I don't know the right numbers right offhand, I think it's like 40-something investors. We also have the treasurers involved. The California treasurer just joined recently as well, along with CalSTARS. We've been co-chair for probably the last 4 years, but we're involved in diversity efforts in a long period of time. And we're really asking boards, and so our assets under management are about $6 trillion, I think even more at this point. But the effort is, and we just changed our mission, and it was really to be more inclusive, not just of gender, but of people of color, because we were finding, and so the other two initiatives in our diversity initiatives per se is, I think there's 5 other large institutional investors. They're global investors like APG, PGGM, Railpen, Legal General, ourselves, and we, we are engaging companies on diversity, but also about board effectiveness and the composition of the board. And so that's one piece. But the example I was going to use is our California initiative. And we started with CalPERS, and we did the state universities. So they joined us for a period of time, and then the Los Angeles County Employees Retirement System. So the unintended consequences of the laws of California had asked for changes in boards to add a woman to your board. And it was positive, and we did get the wind behind our sails. We got lots of women appointed to the board. In fact, we're looking at, the number of companies that still have, that we are invested in, that still have 0 women on the board. There's fines, of course, as well, but also our withhold vote, which Michael spoke about. But some of the unintended consequences there is that we found that most of the companies appointed white women, and that is a positive point. But are they, and we're always asking companies, are you throwing your net out wide? Are you using what they call the Rooney Rule, so that boards are looking at their process of identifying and bringing in candidates that are diverse? And then we also are changing it to include the C-suite, right, and the pipeline diversity, because that tells a lot. So, so we have lots of different efforts on diversity. I think the efforts are helping move companies, but it's still slow. I think if you look at the percentage of women on boards, the percentage of diverse candidates on boards is still quite low. And I think through all of these efforts on our diversity efforts at CalSTRS, we are all pivoting. You know, the recent issues have really caused us to sort of pivot and think, okay, are we pushing just women on the board or diverse candidates on the board and also the C-suite? Because the research is not just on women per se. It is also about ethnic and racial diversity. It's also about experience. It's also about education. You know, what can you bring to the company? What can you bring to the board with your diverse ideas? I think Michael can't hear you.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry. The research is unfortunately biased toward women, both for the board and for senior management, because unless companies tell us, we don't know how diverse, we don't know whether they have people of color on their board or in their senior management. If there was more robust disclosure, it would allow more academics to assess the correlation between diversity and performance. I would say that there is more research on diversity, unfortunately.
Yes, and Michael, you're right. I mean, even as investors, right? The data providers, even like Bloomberg, you know, others, ISS, whatever, we don't have robust information to be able to engage companies. Pictures don't work, you know, so we really want companies and board members and potential candidates and C-suite individuals to self-identify. So, you know, pictures and just by last names, that's not going to help us, right? We all know that. So.
Yeah, it's difficult. I want to get to questions soon, but I want to get one last question in before I get to questions, which is, what comes after disclosure? Where is this going? I mean, I think we all want to see more companies disclose, but where do we go from there? And this is for all of you.
I can start. I mean, I think I alluded to it earlier on, right? With the COVID-19, with the racial injustice and some of the issues that have come up, it really has elevated companies and institutional investors to sort of look at how are we addressing this? How are we engaging our portfolio companies? How are we allocating our capital? But then I think it's important for us to elevate through our vote, our no votes. CalSTRS changed their policy, their governance policy, and then the next year we'll be voting against any board, whether they're even global boards with 0 women on the board. We used to vote against just the nominee and corporate governance committee after we engaged the company. So we had our no vote then. Many of my colleagues, like Michael and others, they've had much more stringent, you know, where they will say, if a company doesn't have 40% of women on the board, they're going to vote against the directors. So it's moving, and our momentum's moving, but we also can elevate it through shareholder proposals and state controllers, or excuse me, a city controller, sorry, Michael, and many of our other institutional investors, and including CalSTRS. We are looking hard at how we're going to use many different tools in our toolkit to help elevate and push companies in the right direction.
So I agree with Mary, but I would say, you know, our systems, you know, we're a little smaller than CalSTRS. I think we're a little over $200 billion. I mentioned that we have about 3,000 companies here in the US. So we invest mainly through index strategies. So we can't do the Wall Street walk if we don't like, you know, the composition of a company's board or workforce. The only way that we can create and protect value is to engage our portfolio companies. I think if we get the disclosure, it'll just equip us to have more, I think, better engagements around when companies do highlight, you know, all their initiatives to recruit a diverse workforce. It'll allow us to actually make an assessment, you know, is that real? Is there investment in all of these various initiatives, you know, paying off?
I think I'd really like to see this data start a conversation around centering equity when making decisions around hiring, promotion, when making decisions at companies in general. I think that it helps us understand where inequities lie at a company, and it helps us understand maybe why, or explore why that might be the case. And I think I'd like to see it shift the framework and the way in which we approach equity at companies, and have equity really be a center and a feature of decision making in that way. And I think that this data is a first step to kind of getting the conversation started, to acknowledge and reckon with the inequities that exist, and then determine ways in which, by centering equity, we can start ameliorating some of these issues. And so I think for me, that's kind of a grand vision of what that looks like. But I think that it first starts with disclosure around the EEO1 report, and then builds into more robust disclosure around all of the different human capital metrics that we've talked about today. And hopefully we'll get to a place where we can start thinking about ways to tackle inequity in the workplace in a meaningful way.
Great, so I'm gonna thank you all. I'm going to pass this over to Allison for the questions that people have written in.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you everyone. That was a really interesting conversation. We're getting a ton of questions, and just a reminder, if folks want to ask a question, you can chat in the box, and we'll get it straight away. And we have had a number of questions on if this is being recorded. It is being recorded. We will be posting it on our website at justcapital.com. So if anyone wants to share it with others, we'll be posting that shortly. Okay, so the first question is, can you talk about the connection between diversity and equity and broader inequality and human capital and worker issues? So just making that connection to racial equity and diversity and broader worker experiences that people have underway.
I can jump in, right? Or Kavya, go ahead, please. Kavya,
no, please, after you.
So, I think that trying to pull this together it's really the baseline, right? Really the information behind it, because the inequalities or the unintended biases are affecting companies because if they're not utilizing their workforce properly, right? If they're not identifying the right candidates, they're not having the right processes to bring in the best candidates, then it's just hurting the company itself, right? So trying to address that, there's so much we have to do, right? I think, we have these conversations all the time, right? All of us have unintended biases, right? And we're trying to learn through that, and we're trying to get past that. But I think it's something that has to be addressed at the company level, and realize that without these changes, it's only hurting the value of the company, the value of utilizing your right resources. You're going to having intellectual property walking out your door. You're going to lose people. So, really understanding the value of it all.
Yeah. I think the conversation about the broader inequalities and kind of how systemic racism plays a role in many barriers that are created for Black and Brown workers in the labor market, I think is an incredibly important one. I think there's discrimination in job searches, there's occupational segregation, there's other aspects around lower wages, there's increased risks of being fired, there are higher levels of unemployment that Black and Brown workers face. And considering all of these things that are the result and continued to be perpetuated by systemic racism, I think companies playing an active role in understanding and assessing the diversity of their workforce and pinpointing at each stages these different barriers that certain workers might experience and addressing those with really meaningful policies and practices, I think is critical in playing a role in reducing the impact of systemic racism on Black and Brown communities. And so I think the inequality conversation around it is a much bigger one, and it's so complex in many different ways. But I think that curating an understanding of what the workforce is, what barriers may be for Black and Brown workers, particularly women of color, especially in light of COVID and the financial insecurity that's being brought on by that, I think is a really critical first step to ensuring that there is representation and that we aren't perpetuating some of those biases and discriminations along the labor market pathway.
Thanks, Kavya. I was
Also,
struck.
I would add that
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
in terms of linking the workplace diversity question to the broader societal question of racial justice, as we note in the letter, if a leadership of a company is really committed, this is an area where they actually can exercise an impact and have some control over their own workforce.
Absolutely.
And there's simple things, right? There's simple things companies can do, right? Even just in the hiring practices. How many of us take names off of applications and utilize and review those that way? How many of us screen, so that there's no unintended biases, so the discrimination is even at the basic level.
Yeah.
And the way that they, oh, sorry, Allison.
No, I was struck. We did a poll a couple weeks ago of Americans on how they felt about racial equity and what to prioritize, and we oversampled Black Americans and asked what the priority among Black Americans was, and the top one was pay a living wage, which I think was really interesting to broader questions, and I think married to the human capital metrics of recognizing that diversity takes place in an economic sort of environment that is about measuring the kinds of job opportunities and the kinds of wages, and safety obviously is increasingly a big issue too. Kavya, do you want to say a final point before I ask the next one? Sure. Okay. All right. Well, I know we have a lot of companies on the line, and so I want to ask a question we got in. Companies often say that they're concerned about litigation if they release this data. Aside from the fact that some companies already release it, do you have suggestions to counter this pushback?
I'm wondering.
I have heard that before.
I think we lost Michael.
Rebecca, why don't you chime in, and then if Michael comes back.
What if companies are worried about litigation for just releasing it, it suggests that there may be a problem that you would have with your workforce anyway. I mean, that's my I'm just hearing that. That's what I'm thinking. But I'm wondering what, just on the basis of releasing alone, I don't think that would draw litigation.
Yeah. Michael and Mary, is this something you hear when it comes to disclosure on various human capital metrics, including diversity?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. When I alluded to the advertising industry before about being unresponsive, we did hear that. I'm not sure that I fully understand it. I'm not an attorney.
I'll pick up from where Michael stopped.
But it is aggregate data.
Go, Mary. Go, Mary.
Sorry, Michael.
Mary, I'm sorry. Are you talking?
No, go ahead, please. If we can get you, please.
No, I'm sorry. I think I froze while you were speaking. No, I'm not sure I have anything more to add.
Okay. No, I was just going to add to what Michael said. I think we hear that, but I think what Rebecca said was a really telling point, right? So if you have information or data that is not very reflective of where you want to be, then move the needle, move the changes, work towards that. But identifying that, investors, stakeholders, everyone is interested in understanding. And if you put out the narrative, no one's going to penalize companies. I'm not saying about the litigation because I am not a lawyer, but the piece there might be. But I think over the broad information of what the company is doing, the demographics, identifying, it's only going to help the company.
Kavya, I'm also wondering, in the tech industry, which has released this, was there increased litigation, or is that something that did actually happen?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, not something that we track at this point in time, but I think it's certainly interesting to follow up and see whether there is increased litigation within the industries that have disclosed.
Thank you. We're getting a couple of questions, Michael and Mary, about what are the next steps for your work on EEO-1. Mary, you sort of alluded to this at the end of what you were saying about, you know, are you considering engaging in proxy season based on responsiveness? Have another question about many investors are using voting rights to vote against boards and committees. Because boards have not added women, will they start to do the same for a lack of racial diversity? Can you talk a little bit more specifically about where you think both your pension funds, as well as more broadly, will go next to be pushing for additional racial equity and disclosure?
I think we should leave it to Michael first. Michael, do you want to talk? Because you are driving the letters right now on EEO-1.
Sure. We have been quite transparent that we are likely to submit shareholder proposals to companies that are not responsive and may oppose the election of directors. But, you know, we have a bright line. Our board election guideline has a gender diversity minimum of 20%. We will withhold for boards that don't hit that threshold. But our guideline specifically also includes race, not in the 20%, and it says that we may revisit the guideline once the data become available. It's just very difficult for us to systemically implement a voting guideline based on people of color in the board.
So I think to add on to what Michael's saying, you know, I think that most investors right now are in the post-proxy season, right? And we're evaluating our vote.
Offsetting, you know, racial diversity.
And I think it is really important for us to, as investors, we're reflecting on our principles and our voting practices and how we can elevate that, but also our engagement process, right? I think Michael mentioned that earlier too, because, you know, although, you know, we always want to engage companies, we're not going to divest from a company. We want to place the table. We want to be able to provide the returns for our constituents. But I think more investors, especially since COVID-19 and all the issues that are happening with racial injustice, have really decided to ensure that their stewardship groups are evaluating what is the best way and what is the most stringent and opportunity to be able to help move the needle.
Thank you. And I know we're almost at time. I have an interesting question that's sort of a follow-up to this, so let me just ask it quickly. Can the investors give an example of when the data that they have available has led to a specific decision on engaging or not engaging a company?
We do it all the time, right? We're doing the screening. So right now we're going to be screening. So whether it is the Russell 3000, whether it's the a different index, whatever it might be that we're using. We have lots of different indices that we use at CalSTRS to benchmark. So depending on our different initiatives, we're doing that right now, right? We're screening on board diversity. We're screening on where we can. We're trying to move to racial and ethnic diversity. And so we're screening on that. And that will lead to us engaging those companies, writing letters, identifying them. And I think that the COVID-19, right, has also elevated safety and well-being, paid sick leave, all of that, furloughed employees. So you're going to find that investors are going to be opening that dialogue and that conversation in their engagement. So definitely, we're screening right now because we're going to be out there engaging.
Same thing. We screened to identify our focus company. I'm not on, can you hear me now? We screened in terms of identifying our focus list for the letters. And also we've been submitting proposals, as Mary referenced the Rooney Rule, where we've asked boards not only to have a diverse slate when they select new directors, also for when they do a CEO search. And so we are looking at company, well, frankly, diversity in the C-suite is abysmal today, and particularly among CEOs. But we are certainly screening, and we submit a lot of shareholder proposals, and it's an easy way to screen. Look for companies either that are, I mean, it's not always low. We don't know. We can't answer the question unless they give us the data.
Yeah, and I think we are going to be screening through that global initiative that I spoke about with our investors, our other institutional members. We can get that data right on women in C-suite, right? And so we are going to be engaging companies, at least definitely on women in C-suite. But if we can get the racial and ethnic diversity as well, we're going to be engaging companies on.
Great. Well, I see we're at time. I want to thank you all for such a rich dialogue. This was so interesting. If anyone, again, we did record it, so justcapital.com, we will be posting the webinar. If anyone has any questions, you can email us at corpengage, CORPENGAGE at justcapital.com. Again, just want to thank Rebecca, Kavya, Michael, and Mary. It was really interesting, and looking forward to working with all of you and continuing to push this work forward. Feels like we're just at the beginning. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.